First thing that I want to share with everyone is a greeting in Hebrew. And this is how folks greet each other in Israel when it's morning. And what they say is Boker Tov. Think of it as B-O-K-E-R-T-O-V. Boker means morning, Tov means good. So Boker Tov.
Boker Tov.
Very good. The other thing that they do in Hebrew is if they want to know how someone is, they'll say to a man, Ma shalomcha, and it means, what is your peace, or how is your peace? Or to a woman, Ma shalomech, different ending for a woman, how is your peace? Now, one of the things that I want to point out, and we will go through this in stages today, is just to remind us that a part of this class is learning some Hebrew. And my intention, and I believe this hope will be fulfilled, is that by the end of this course, everyone here will have a basic understanding of how to pronounce not just Hebrew letters, but even how to sound out Hebrew words. You won't be expert or fluent at it, but you'll be able to look at a Hebrew word and basically be able to say it. I will say this, though, that it's not always clear to me how well what I'm teaching is being communicated. And so as we go along, if questions arise, feel free to either drop me an email, call me up on the phone if it's a longer conversation that we need to have, or in relatively short order, even on these classes, we'll be able to just stop and answer questions. And I'll give you an example of that in just a minute. One of the things that we looked at last week was the first word that I was having all of you learn, and it was Bereshit. It's actually two words. And if you look in your notebook on page 3, this is the word that we looked at last week, Bereshit. And then we went through the letters that make up this word. Well, someone asked me a most interesting question which had never occurred to me. And the question was, why do they have names? If they're just the letters in an alphabet, why do they have names? In the English alphabet, A is A. So why in Hebrew, if it's the equivalent of the letter A, do we call it Aleph? And in English, B is B, C is C, D is D. Why in Hebrew would it be Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet? And this had never even occurred to me that it would be a question, why do the characters have names other than in English? So I thought it through, and I thought about other languages. I have rusty German, and that alphabet goes A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, X, Y, Z. And as I got to the end of that, I realized that some of those letters, like X, Y, Z, are actually pretty long words. And so then I went back to the English alphabet and realized that when you get to W, well, that little thing like that is never pronounced W. It's W, right? Or like in few, it's a U sound, but it has a name which is W. And if I were to write it down, it would be like D-O-U-B-L-E-U, right? W. That would sort of be the name. So it maybe is less obvious to us in English because we all grew up learning the alphabet, but the names that we call the letters in our alphabet are actually their names. It's very seldom that the letter A is pronounced A.
Greek?
Greek is the same. Alpha and Omega, right? The beginning and the end. For us, A and Z. So the letters in the English alphabet actually do have names. It's just most of the names are just really short and they end with E, like A, B, C, D. But in Hebrew, the letters, as they do in English, it's just not obvious to us, they have names. And so if you just see the letter by itself, you would call it Bet. The first letter in Bereshit, you'd pronounce that Bet if it was just sitting by itself, Bet. Just as we would say B if we saw the letter B sitting by itself. But we almost never pronounce it that way unless it's just in a list. which is lettered. Okay, does this making sense? All right, so now I want to go back and review a little bit this word which we learned last week, this word bereshit. And I'm going to do this each week, both because I suspect most of us need a little bit of review just to help the stuff stick to us. And if there are some of you that just pick up languages like that, then I just ask your indulgence as we do our weekly review of what we learned the week before. Is that acceptable? Okay. So the letters we learned last week in this word bereshit start with bet. And remember, Hebrew goes right to left, not left to right. So it starts with this letter bet. If you'll remember, I said maybe a way to remember this character is if there was a line here and like that, it would be a B for us, right? So just imagine this little line fell over. And so now it's open on this side with a little extended line on the bottom. That's bet. And we're going to learn the aleph bet, not just in sequence like A through Z, aleph through tav. We're going to learn it as we learn words. And so it should come a little bit more organically rather than just trying to memorize all of those letters together. I should also note that the first video from last week is already posted online. If you go to resurrection.org, if you didn't see the class last week, if you weren't here, you can go there and watch the whole class. And all of the materials in the notebook are also published there right above the videos. So anytime you miss a class, you can catch it. The video will be posted generally by about Wednesday of the week, and the materials will be right there with it. So you can stay up even if you have to be away. So bet for the bereshit. Now, look at this word again. Bereshit, as I said, that's actually two words, not one. The very first, the letter bet in this word is a preposition, and it means at. So this word is actually at reshit, whatever reshit is. The very first character, the bet, this character, is the preposition at. And the example I gave last week was if I asked the question, Apho Rebecca, or Apho John, or Apho Spencer, means where is Spencer, where is John, where is Rivka, or where is Rebecca, where is Apho Spencer. The answer, if they're at home, is babayit. The ba means at, bayit is home. So if somebody's at home, you say, babayit, they're at home. Sometimes you'll also notice in people who grew up with Yiddish, if they want you to come over to their house, they'll say, come by my house. And I don't know whether that's actually related to the Hebrew, but it might be. Yiddish is an extraordinary language because it's actually a form of German, but it's written in Hebrew letters. I don't know if you've ever seen real Yiddish written down, not an anglicized version of it, but real Yiddish in the Jewish Forward or other newspapers, magazines, and Yiddish literature. If you look at it, it looks like Hebrew, but it's actually German written in the Hebrew alphabet, the Hebrew aleph bet. Isn't that puzzling? What? Hard to sort of grasp that, but true nevertheless. All right, so the first character in Bereshit is the ba. And let me just also say this too. If this doesn't all come just that quick, don't worry about it. There's no test. We're going to go over things, and a lot of it you'll just absorb it as we go along. And 4 weeks from now, when I hold this up, everybody will know it's bet. It'll just be a natural part of what we're learning. So don't ever get worried about that. And again, if you ever have a question or you're puzzled or whatever, just let me know, because it probably means somebody else is puzzled in the same way, and it will allow me to correct what it is I'm doing to make it better. So, first letter, bet. Now, let me just ask, how do you pronounce this Hebrew letter? Okay, but if you were to say it, it's an R. So it's called resh. That's the name of the character, but it's pronounced like an R, and it looks like a backwards R. That's probably the easiest one to remember. If you're going right to left, then your R is going to be in that direction. Resh is the name of the character. So it's Bere, so that's the second letter in Bereshit. And then this letter, what's this? Shin, or sin. This is my favorite letter in the Hebrew alphabet, and I'll explain why that's so a little bit later. And it actually has some extraordinary implications, including in the Shema, which we went over last week. Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. First word in the Shema starts with the letter Shin. And I think that's actually very meaningful, and we'll come back to that a little bit later on. So that's the third letter, that's an S sound. And if you'll remember, when it has a dot above it, I looked at this earlier this morning and I was thinking, this is really confusing stuff. And there's so much, and there's so much little detail. How do you ever keep up with it? But you will, I promise. It all, at some point, it'll just become, oh yeah, that's, and it'll be recognized, so just don't worry. So here's Shin. If that little dot is there, then it's a Shin, okay? Same character, but this tells us, it gives us a hint about how to pronounce it. If this little dot is over here, it's Sin, okay? So that's it's called nikud. This little dot is called a nikud. It's vowelization. You'll also notice that there are sometimes dots or lines underneath letters, and those are also hints to pronunciation. And we'll go over those as we go along. You don't have to know them all in advance.
What was the pronunciation with the dot on the right?
Sin.
And the dot in the middle?
With the dot, I'm sorry, with the dot on the left, it's sin. With the dot on the right, it's shin. So, shin, S-H-I-N. Okay. This is on page 3 in the notebook.
That's part of the old Hebrew, or are they something a recent addition?
It's the same. Yeah. When you read ancient Hebrew, such as in a Torah scroll, there are no dots on it. There are no underlines. There are no nikudim. So you don't get the vowel hints in a Torah scroll. You have to know how to pronounce the word when you see the characters. But in modern Hebrew, they've added the vowelization to help in the pronunciation.
The S up here doesn't look like the S you held up. No.
You're right, it doesn't. And if you think about, let me just hold this up and you can compare them. You can see they're both three-legged, solid on the bottom, open on the top. That one's a little bit fancier. And it's similar to the difference between, say, the Helvetica font, which has no serifs on it, no little feet at the bottom or top, and the Times Roman font, which is a serifed font. So it has little feet at the top as well. Hebrew is similar. It has different fonts that it can be produced in, and sometimes they're a little bit fancier. In fact, when I show you a Torah scroll in the next week or two, and I show you the beginning of Genesis, you'll see that some of the characters, in addition to everything you see there, have got what are called crowns on them. And that is a flourish that the scribe does when he's recording the scriptures from one to another, is they flourish the top of some of the letters just to say this is really important. So I'll show you some of those as we go along. But the major difference here is just a font style. It's not a difference in the letter.
The dot goes in the center then? One through that font?
No, that dot up there at the top is really supposed to be on the right.
Oh.
It's just the way it printed. So shin. Okay, this letter is Yod, right. Yod, the tiniest letter in the Hebrew alphabet, just a jot, okay, Yod. And it's usually pronounced like an I or a Y sound. And then at the end, what's that? Tav, and it has the T sound, T. And I'm not quite sure how to tell you. Did I skip Aleph? I did. Oh, shame on me. There's Aleph. It's actually usually not pronounced, but it's used in the pronunciation. It's the third character in Bereshit, Aleph. And I said the only way I can think of remembering this is to think of aerobics, and this is somebody doing jumping jacks. So that's aerobics, it's the A, the Aleph, the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet. And then
Thinking like first graders attempted the letter N.
attempted the letter N for a first grader, yeah, mine particularly. So this is Tav, and I don't know, it looks like somebody kicking somebody else. And anybody else have a great mnemonic to remember this? I don't. So let's just force ourselves to remember this. It's Tav, and it's pronounced like T. So that first opening, beginning of Genesis, Bereshit, at the beginning. And the Reshit, if you'll remember I explained last week, is from a root, resh, which means head, which can be like the head of a river. That's the beginning of a river, right? Or the head of a list, the beginning of a list. Or Rosh Hashanah. The Rosh means head of the year. So the new year in Hebrew and among Jews when they celebrate is called Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, the beginning of the year. So at the beginning of book 1, sentence 1, word 1 in the Bible is Bereshit, at the head, at the beginning. Okay? Everybody, any other questions before I press on? All right. So now turn to the new page, and that is page 5. If you'll remember on the page 3 where I showed you this first word, Bereshit, in the beginning or at the beginning created God the heavens, the earth. We looked at the first word there. Now we're going to go to the next verse, which was, the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. And we're going to spend a little time on this page, on page 5, for reasons which initially at least are not about Hebrew. They're about what is being said here in this sentence. And we'll come back and relate it to the first part of the other sentence as well. The earth was formless and void. You'll see in a translation I'm going to show you in a minute that another way that that might be said is the earth was wild and waste. And the sense of it in the Hebrew isn't that there was nothing. I know we often think of creation as it's described in the book of Genesis as ex nihilo. That's the Latin for it. In other words, creation out of nothing. Now, God may well have created the entire universe out of nothing. There may have been a point when God was and nothing else was. But that's not what it says at the beginning of the book of Genesis. What it actually says is that there was something there, but it was formless, that it was chaotic, if you would. And the word created, at the beginning, created God, the word created there is actually a word which means to form. And so it could be what a potter does to clay. Could be what a sculptor does to marble or to steel. The idea is that something which was unformed, which was chaotic, if you would, was formed. And then it begins to describe what it looked like after it was formed. Everybody tracking with this? Nothing I'm saying here is heretical or heterodox. All I'm saying is that we've all had a lot of assumptions about the nature of creation, and we've sort of read those assumptions into the beginning of the book of Genesis when we read it. But what the Hebrew actually says isn't quite God spoke and out of nothing came everything, but rather God formed something which was chaotic and put it in good order. That's really what's being said here in the Hebrew. Could be that just before that there wasn't anything and he spoke and then everything appeared and then he shaped it. But part of the challenge there is that God is not subject to time. Time isn't God's God. Time is a creation. It's a part of creation. So it's under God's authority. God created time. And so it's very difficult for human beings who live in time to look back at the creation before there was morning and evening the first day and understand what's going on. Because we think about everything in terms of time and sequence. And yet God is outside of that.
Is there any place in the scripture where it does say that God by fiat spoke and something was created from nothing?
There are some things like that, and we'll probably come to them. But that's not what's here. Okay?
Is there part of Scripture that states God is outside time? Is that...
No, actually, it's a really interesting question. He said, is there a part of Scripture that states that God is outside of time? There are some things that imply that when it talks about how people are called, how they are known before they are created. The implication is that even before they were born or knew there was time, God knew what would come of them. So there are a lot of places where it's implied, but there isn't even any discussion specifically about God and time in Scripture. It's a really good question. Any other questions before I press on? All right. Now back to page 5. Let me show you one thing first to start off, and that is was over. That's the 6th word down. Was over, al. It's ayin lamed in Hebrew, and that's another preposition. It's just like our word over in Hebrew, it's al. Ayin, a letter we haven't learned yet, and lamed, we're going to learn that in a minute. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Now I want to show you a couple of things here. One is the word Elohim. That's around 8 or 9 down. And I'm going to actually show you that word. It starts with Aleph. If you look there, the second column from the right is the word Elohim. It's written pretty small there, but you can see it begins with Aleph. We already know that. In fact, I think I have a page here for this. Yeah, turn to the very last page. And there you have Elohim. It's Aleph, Lamed, He, Yod, Mem. And I'm going to talk through that now. It starts with Aleph, a letter we already know, and that's why I have it in black in your notebook. And then comes Lamed. Ignore the dot for the moment. That's the letter L in Hebrew, Lamed. It's pronounced like an L. So we've got L, O, L, there's the L sound. That little dot up there means the letter O, or the vowel O. Remember, there are no vowels in Hebrew. Is there anybody's brain just sort of collapsing in on itself now? It'll come, I promise. So if you look at this word in your notebook on page 10, Elohim, the second letter is this Lamed, which is pronounced like an L. And that little dot up there means that it's L-O. This will make more sense as we go along. So it's L-O, and then that next word, He, actually, is an H sound. And then there's that little yod. We already know the yod. And then at the very end is an M. It's pronounced mem in Hebrew. And if you look at the bottom of this column, you'll see that there are actually two ways that mem is written. If it couldn't be more confusing, a single letter is now written two different ways. And the difference is when mem appears at the beginning or inside a word, it looks like this, the first one. But when mem appears at the very end of a word, it changes to that little sort of square with a tail. So now if you look back to this word, Elohim, that's the word Elohim.
Was there a reason for that?
We'd probably have to go back 3,500 years and find whoever it was that had that idea and go, why did you do that? Now, if there's a reason, I don't know what it is, but there are 2 or 3 different characters in Hebrew that change their shape if they're at the end of a word. And mem is one of them. Risa. Thank you. That's true. She says, on the whole, Hebrew doesn't have nearly as many changes to the rule as English does. Once you get the basics, pretty much it's going to be the same all the time, with a couple of odd little variations that I'll expose as we go along. But pretty much, when you learn the basic rules, you got it, and it doesn't then get more and more complex. So Elohim. Now, the reason I wanted to spend some time with that word Elohim, going back now to page 5, back on page 5, Elohim, and the Spirit of God was moving. The word Elohim there is one of the main words in Hebrew for God. There are several major words. El is one of them, Elohim is another, and this word up here, which we haven't pronounced yet, which is Yod-He, Vav-He, is how it's spelled, is a word of extraordinary importance in Hebrew, and it's an extraordinary important name of God, but its pronunciation is a huge subject. And I'm not going to go over that today, just use that as a teaser. We will come back to that really important word. Adonai is another common name for God. It means Lord. In fact, there is a very famous psalm where David says, the Lord said to my Lord. And there's 2 different words there. And people who read Hebrew, having read that psalm in the Hebrew, some of them have become Christians in reading that simple psalm, and I'll come back to why that might be true in a subsequent class. What I want to do, at least in part, is help everybody to be aware that there is so much going on that we typically don't see or know in the English. And I don't mean secret, esoteric stuff. I just mean simple stuff that's there in the language and structure of Hebrew, which when we begin to be able to see it, really opens windows into heaven for us. We begin to see something about the greatness and the breadth and the majesty of God, which just pours through the scriptures, and which is even more evident when we have some idea of the Hebrew. But we're going to look at all of those structures as well. So Elohim is one of the major words for God in the Old Testament. And as I said last week, this word is unique because sometimes it's used to refer to other gods. So if we were to talk about the gods of the Philistines, you could say the Elohim of the Philistines. But when you said that word Elohim, in referring to God's multiple of the Philistines, takes a plural verb, like boys. What's a good plural verb? Boys build. Boy builds. Okay? So when you have a single word boy, then you have a single verb build. Boy builds. boy builds a treehouse. If you have a group of boys, you say boys build. You see, the verb changes because the noun is plural. A plural noun has to have a plural verb to go along with it. And when the Bible refers to other gods as Elohim, anytime those Elohim are doing something, because Elohim is plural, the I am at the end tells us it's plural, has to take a plural verb. Everybody got that? Except when it refers to the God of Israel. And this is a really interesting thing. It's certainly interesting for Christians, but it's just it's a fact of enormous importance and of much discussion, even among the theologians, Jewish theologians, because the word Elohim, which means God in Hebrew, when it refers to the God of Israel, takes a singular verb, which is just, I think it's just extraordinary. So, now, knowing that, turn to the next. Sure. Yes, it's always a plural word. Yeah. The other thing that I wanted to show here is if you look again on this page 5 to and the Spirit, v'ruach or weh-ruach, and the Spirit. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 down on page 5, and the Spirit. The va at the beginning of that word on the right side means and then ruach is those two letters. I don't really want to look at that word to learn how to spell it, but I want you to see what happens if you look all the way over on the left where it says Strong's. You see that? Strong's, and it says 7307. Now if you turn to the next, sorry, that's not the word I wanted you to look at. Instead, go down 2 more to was moving. Okay? And Strong's is 7363. So normally when we hear Genesis 1 translated, what we hear is the earth was formless and void, and darkness over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving or hovering over the surface of the waters. You recognize that? We've all read it many, many times. Look at the Strong's number, 7363. Now, many of you already know what Strong's is about, but let me just share that for those who might not. There's something called Strong's Concordance. You can get it either in a book which is about that thick and about that tall, it's huge, or you can now get it online. And in fact, if you go to the websites that I have hot linked in these documents online, these same documents you have here are now on the resurrection.org website under starting with Genesis. If you go to the documents there, all of these things are hot linked. So if you go to this word on page 5, where I've got the columns of the words, the English, the Hebrew, the pronunciation, and then the Strong's, all the way over on the left, the Strong's numbers are all hot linked to the actual Strong's entry online. So if you go to this online, what you see here in your notebook is actually hot linked to the actual Strong's number. And what the Strong's Concordance does is it takes every single word in the entire Bible, Tanakh and New Testament, Old Testament, New Testament, and it has a complete definition, all of the uses for it, and all the places that it appears. It's quite extraordinary. So let's take this as an example, 7363. Turn the page. And this is the word normally translated moving or hovering. Okay? Rachaf. And what does the word mean? Relax. Isn't that interesting? That it means relax. And in fact, if you look down just a little bit further to the verb hover, it actually has several different meanings, and I'm not going to go through all of them. The reason I want to show you this is so you can go look at it. I've got it printed out and you can look at it in your notebook, but if you go to the Strong's Concordance online, in it there are other hot links to various dictionaries and sources where you can really read up on a given word. So this particular word, which is normally translated moving or hovering, is sometimes translated brooding. Okay, now what do you think of when you think of the word brooding? Sorry, that's too good an answer. He's got it right. So what you normally think of when brooding is like this. Right, you're either mad about something and you're thinking really hard about it, or you're thinking to try to figure out how to do something, brooding, okay? But what do animals do when they reproduce? They brood, that's right. And this word for the Spirit of God hovering over that which is wild and waste, the word is, that's the root. It means brooding in that sense. Isn't this wild? I think it's extraordinary, because the idea is that somehow the Spirit of God hovers and then earth explodes with life. So it's a really fascinating word, and you can find this yourselves just by following these links in the online materials, okay? And then I give an example in here of other places where it appears. Now turn to page 8. We're almost done here for the day. What I've got here is something called the Schocken Bible. Schocken is the name of the publisher. The translator is a man named Everett Fox. And this is it. This is what's being referred to there, and what you're going to read there, and I'm going to read some of it out loud, actually comes right out of this. This is what I would call a scholar's Bible. It's called the 5 Books of Moses. It's actually just the Torah, just Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's all that's here. You can see how thick it is. It's because it's with commentary by Everett Fox. Everett Fox is a highly renowned scholar of Hebrew and of Old Testament. If you remember last week when I was talking about my Hebrew professor, Dwayne Christensen, who just really opened up the scriptures to me, he's one of the sources that Fox cites in the back of his book, which I just found that wonderful. So this Schocken Bible Volume 1 is just the 5 books of Moses. And here's how it reads, and there are a couple of points I'm going to make as I read it, and then we'll be done for the day. At the beginning of God's creating of the heavens and the earth, you see it's movement. It's not just past tense once, but of the creating. At the beginning of the creating of the heavens of the earth, when the earth was wild and waste, darkness over the face of the ocean, rushing Spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters. It's also the word used for what birds do when they hover like that, or flitting. It's another translation. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw the light, that it was good. God separated the light from the darkness. God called. Notice that every one of these begins with the word God. It's there, structured that way in the Hebrew. God, 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 God. So that you know when you've read this, it's really clear. It's not been smoothed out so it all reads really nicely. It's hammered. God, 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 God. So that as you read this, it becomes really clear that there's nothing going on here except what God is doing. That God is the author, the finisher. He is the source. He is everything in the creation of all of this. And then the last point I will make today is that everywhere in the first part of Genesis, right up through chapter 2, verse 3, when the word God appears, it is always, always, always Elohim. No other name for God up until that point, always Elohim. Elohim this, Elohim this, Elohim this, Elohim this. And then in chapter 2, verse 4, which I haven't bothered to print, the names of God begin to change. But up until this point, it is only Elohim, 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 with a singular verb, Elohim, Elohim. All right, that's it for today. Any questions, any problems, any things that I need to cover that I haven't?
Going back to the translation of Baraka, where you say it move gently, also cherish, brood. Does it have to be one of those things?
No.
Or can it be all of those
Excellent.
things together to make another?
Excellent question. And this will be the last because we're 2 minutes over and I don't want to do that. I want to quit when I said I would quit. The question is, when it shows all those different definitions, do you have to pick one or can it be several all sort of combined? And the answer is, it is several all combined, which is one of the great challenges of translating it into English. Because in English, you got to pick one. And then somehow you believe that that's what it means, whereas its actual meaning is a whole cluster of definitions simultaneously. All right? Thank you all. See you in a week.
Thank you.